Yes. Thanks. At first, I actually didn't recognize myself, but thanks, Andy, for that nice introduction. And certainly thanks to all the work that CIA has done to make these documents available, and to the Nixon Library for providing this pretty amazing venue for this important seminar. And I should say it's not very hard to lure me to California, since this is where my roots are and hopefully where my future lies. But the fact that it was 19 degrees in Washington when I was thinking about this, and it's now 75 here, it made it even easier to get me out here. But it really, weather and location notwithstanding, it's an important event. It is a service to the nation, and on a topic that is deeply woven into my 30-year career at CIA. I should explain up front, my comments are going to be focused on intelligence in general, on some of the lessons that I've learned in my career, and not necessarily specifically on the '73 war. I'm going to leave that to the extremely qualified people that follow me. But the seminar reinforces the importance that every generation of analysts study history, that we learn the lessons of the past, and that we constantly review and improve our approach to analysis. In the last half century, we've experienced a handful or more of momentous events that the literature refers to as intelligence failures. And if you Google intelligence failure, it's likely that the '73 war is going to be at the top of the list. I was personally involved and perhaps not entirely responsible for several others, including the Iraq War and the 9/11 attacks. And I'm not, I'm suggesting that it's important to study our successes and failures. I'm not suggesting that simply by studying them that we will prevent making them again. Clearly that's not happened. We've studied a great deal. But I do think that the study of our business will make us more conscious of our mistakes, of our vulnerabilities, and will make it less likely that we'll make those mistakes again. It's intimidating for me to stand here and speak the topic of intelligence support and policy when so many people in the audience have so much expertise on the subject. Just among the panelists, Greg has written books on the subject. Bill was in the White House and experienced this event firsthand and has written one of the preeminent texts on the peace process. Emil and Martha have forgotten more about the Middle East than I'll ever know. And Charlie, of course, has seen and done it all. So I thought I would sort of talk a little bit about my unique perspective on a couple of issues that I experienced close hand in terms of the relationship between the intelligence community and the policymaker. I worked for 30 years at the agency, but the two issues really came back in my career over and over again, and that was Iraq and the peace process, and I'll talk a bit about both of those. But as I was perusing the CD that Sandy was waving, and it struck me, 400 documents, literally thousands of pages of material that most people haven't seen before, and I thought how valuable that was. And it's really valuable to a bunch of different people. Three groups came to mind, and the first is just for the general public. I think it gives you a glimpse of a business that is still shrouded in secrecy, probably too much secrecy. The events of 40 years ago really come to life in these documents. And they not only show how intelligence impacted the events of those days, but for me, it really reminded me that those events that happened 40 years ago, they still illuminate what's happening in the Middle East today. The second group are the historians, and I think the tranche of documents will likely be a goldmine. They'll confirm many of the conclusions that historians have had, but I think they'll also clarify in a more detailed way what happened, and maybe more importantly, why it happened. And lastly, and I think from my perhaps biased perspective, the most important audience for these documents are the intelligence analysts themselves. We need to be constantly reminded that we're still susceptible to the sorts of mistakes that we made in '73, and that we're under the same pressure to produce intelligence, and we have the same challenge right now of forging a positive relationship with our policy counterparts. So for all three of those audiences, I think this is a really important event and very valuable documentation. So reading the documents from 40 years ago, this is a decade before I started in the business, it really made me think how much has changed. Back when I started, the top issues of the day were the Cold War and the arms race, and Vietnam had ended a few years before, and we referred to the Arab-Israeli military conflict in most cases. And now in my career, we're dealing with the spread of weapons of mass destruction, the threat of a global jihadist ideology, and looking at the Middle East today. Undefined opportunity, but unpredictable instability all over the region. Those are the issues that are now defining the careers of the people who follow me. But it's also striking how much hasn't changed. The foundation of our business, the way we think about analysis, and I think surprisingly the way we serve our policymaker community, the way we deliver analysis, really hasn't changed that much in 40 years. And looking through the documentation, much of the conversation that occurred after the '73 war struck me as very similar to the conversations we had after the Iraq WMD episode and 9/11. Many of the same themes came up. So it should drive us to do more than study, but rather really to change the way we do business. And in the last 10 years of my career, after 9/11, after Iraq, I think that change and improvement and study really were a hallmark of the intelligence community. So when I was thinking about how do I give a talk to this kind of audience, I struggled with how to make it interesting. How do you describe that relationship between policy and intelligence in an interesting way? And I figured I'd talk about it from my own personal experience. On Iraq, I worked in many forms, in different administrations, under very different circumstances, over a period of maybe 15 years. And the same is true for the peace process. So I'll try and make some personal observations, but I'm not going to describe the entire expanse of history on them. I'm going to pick a couple of snapshots. So I covered Iraq from the earliest stages, actually before the first Gulf War in 1990 through the aftermath of the Second War. I'm going to focus on one specific challenge that I was personally involved in, and that was the hunt for weapons of mass destruction. I won't try and compete with many books and detailed firsthand descriptions of that challenge, but I just wanted to give you a little bit of a flavor for what it was like for someone in the trenches. So the war was over, and the inspections started out, and they started out pretty well. They started out with a bang. We had a couple of pretty exciting wins. We caught the Iraqis with some equipment, and we all thought at the time, looking back, that it was going to be relatively quick, straightforward, and successful. And we did. I think our first experiences really reinforced that going in notion. And then we realized that we had really underestimated the Iraqis. They were far more formidable foes in the inspections arena than they were on the battlefield. They were organized and patient and focused. And we were energetic and enthusiastic, but really didn't have a comprehensive plan. And we made some pretty basic mistakes. Every time, for hundreds, literally, of inspections, if it wasn't successful, pretty often we didn't blame ourselves. We blamed the UN, we blamed the inspectors, we blamed the Iraqis, and amazingly, we were persistent. I mean, it turns out we were too persistent. The inspections lasted for years. We exploited every bit of information we received, convinced all along, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that Saddam had WMD. And all we needed was to find that key that told us where it was. When we pushed hard, we used all sorts of technology, we embraced any scrap of intelligence that hinted at a possible location. And the most impressive was how stubbornly we stuck to our conclusion. Literally hundreds of inspections, most of them dry holes. And they failed to force us to ask ourselves sort of that key question: could our assumptions be wrong? And then came the last round of inspections in 2002. And I won't talk about the WMD NIE. Lots have been written about that. Just the situation we found ourselves in at the time. And we were being pummeled by all sides. George Tenet, I think in his book, described us as becoming the meat in the sandwich. I never really understood what that meant, but it sort of had a ring to it. So we referred to us as the meat in the sandwich. On the one hand, we had a number of critical consumers, many of them in Congress, who were suspicious that the intelligence community wasn't providing the UN with the really good stuff, with the material that would allow the inspectors to find the WMD. And on the other side, we had an administration that was skeptical that after 15 years of dealing with this issue, that any inspection regime was going to be successful. And they had, I think, naturally a lot of reluctance to put a lot of energy and resources into the inspections. And really there was very little reason at that point to be confident that the inspections would be more productive this time around than they were before. So what was interesting, though, looking back at it, was we had lots of debate over, should we do inspections or how should we do inspections, but there really wasn't the debate, either from the right or the left or from our intelligence community colleagues. No one really quarreled with the proposition still that Saddam might not have WMD. We argued about a lot of things, whether we should go to war, whether we were supporting the UN. We had lots of debates over the sort of the building block issues that made up the general proposal that Saddam had WMD. But we never really argued that central point. And it turns out, of course, that both sides, the left and the right, were wrong. Since WMD, that the world thought, was convinced that it was being hidden in Iraq, it wasn't there at all anymore. But being in the middle of that argument was probably the toughest job I've tackled as an intelligence officer. And it has had a lasting and I think positive effect on how we view our business. We've examined ourselves pretty thoroughly since then. And at the end, I'll return to some lessons I personally took away from that experience. But first, let me talk briefly about a very different challenge, providing intelligence to policymakers. And that was during a very active time during the peace process, the very late 1990s and early 2000s. It's not about failure, but rather it speaks to the challenge of supporting an incredibly complex, important, and risky policy adventure, and of supporting policymakers who themselves were unrivaled experts in the Middle East. So I'll reflect on one brief sort of moment in the peace process, and that is the period surrounding a meeting at Camp David in July of 2000, where President Clinton and his team brought Prime Minister Barak, it was Prime Minister Barak's idea, and Chairman Arafat and the Israeli and Palestinian teams to Camp David to try and force them to come to a final agreement. And many books have been written on this subject. Dennis Ross and Aaron Miller and lots of people have a more strategic view of it. I'm going to tell it from my narrow perspective of an intelligence officer trying to support this team. And I suspect few intelligence officers and likely few diplomats at the time would have given this approach more than a very small chance of success. Everyone knew that it was a pretty high-risk scenario. But yet we, as intelligence officers, really struggled with always being the naysayers. Our analysis was that Barak wasn't going to be able to deliver, or might not be able to deliver his own delegation, much less his electorate. The Palestinians were fatally split between generations and other issues. And our feeling at the time was that the older generation had more sway than the younger generation. And it was entirely possible that Arafat was simply genetically incapable of saying yes. But most of these points at the end of the day proved right. But yet, and they didn't come as any surprise to Dennis or Aaron or the or the diplomatic team that was leading the delegation. But it was still a role that we consciously knew we couldn't constantly just be the people who said no. So we asked ourselves, how does someone like Dennis or his team of experts, how do they find any utility in what intelligence has to say? And to his credit, Dennis Ross's deputy, Aaron Miller, used to come and speak to our team of analysts pretty frequently. And he told them they didn't take it personally that we rarely had anything encouraging to tell them. Aaron and Dennis both knew that they needed reality and fact to anchor their policies and their strategies. And they desperately wanted to succeed, but they wanted the truth. And what Aaron told me once, and he told my team, was he said, I realize my job is to imagine the art of the possible. And our job was to remind him what was probable. And I think given that relationship, it needed to be close and continuing and honest, and I think it really was. And it was a challenging time. As George Tenet wrote in his book, he played a unique and I think unprecedented role as the Director of Central Intelligence in the negotiations. He played negotiator sometimes, honest broker, he played father figure, he played any number of roles in between the Israeli and Palestinian delegations. And we always wondered, even as I was driving George around in a little electric cart on the Camp David campus, how could we avert the seemingly inevitable breakdown in talks while remaining conscious of the fact that intelligence had to be absolutely objective. And it was never easy, it was never straightforward, but I think we did retain our distance. And our challenge again was not being the people who always just said, that's not going to work, or you can't do it that way, or this won't fly. So we ended up trying to explain the backdrop between the delegations, the complexities of the public sentiment back home, of the dynamic within the delegations. And we found a niche that I think that the diplomats found pretty useful. But what we never did was pull our punches. I think you can ask them now, but we never said anything but this is a long shot at best. So two very different examples of the case in Iraq where I think hindsight really shows that we didn't perform up to our standards, and the peace process where I think we did. And a great deal has been written on how to improve intelligence, how to improve the relationship between policymakers and intelligence analysts. And I think one of the basic factors is that intelligence has to be good. You can define, you can debate over what good means, but we have to do the best job we can at producing analysis. And we haven't always in the past, and we've learned from our mistakes. And I picked 7 specific things that I learned in my career, and I know that I'm sort of an expert at these mistakes because over the last 30 years, I've made pretty much most of them. And they overlap, and if anyone's taking notes in the end of my list, you come up with 6 or 8, that's okay, because I just picked 7. So the first lesson, and it really comes from my experience in Iraq, is never focus on the precision of language. You want to make absolutely sure that the audience knows what you mean, that you don't give the audience the choice of figuring out what you might mean. And on Iraq, our language was not always precise. Sometimes we made judgments that were not supported that well, that were too broad. We could have distinguished better between what a stockpile was and what a breakout capacity was, the difference between intentions and capabilities. So I look back and I think that was a really important lesson that we, I think, have taken on board. The second lesson is that we need to have the stomach to revisit our long-held conclusions. No matter how long we've been saying something, we need to sort of have the strength of will to go back and say, all right, we've been saying this for a long time. Is it still true? We might have asked ourselves, for example, sometime along the way, after the inspections had resulted in so little, we might have questioned our assumption that Saddam would never give up his WMD. That was a deeply ingrained assumption, not just in the intelligence community, but in the population at large. And we should have examined that a little bit more closely. So third is never take sides. Don't advocate a policy position. And in short, there's a big difference between supporting a policymaker, which was our job, and supporting a policy, which isn't. Fourth, avoid groupthink. Never limit yourself to just one hypothesis, no matter how many people support it. I think the lesson of 1973 that the panelists will talk about reflects on this a bit. I mean, you see in the documentation that was handed out that one of the things that affected our judgment about whether or not there would be a war was what the Israelis thought. The Israelis thought there's not going to be a war, and we probably put too much weight on that. In the case of Iraq, in the case of the 73 war, there was at least discussion, there was debate, there was a weighing of evidence. In the case of Iraq, there wasn't enough of that. There was no real debate. So we knew Saddam had WMD. We didn't know exactly what it was or where it was, but we knew he had it. So fifth, it's a little bit related to that. Don't get trapped by your past judgments. So what I mean is the longer we stick to a line, the more products, the more pieces of analysis, the more articles for the president, for the Congress, the more strategic analytic pieces we write that have the same bottom line, the harder it is to back off on that. Harder because you become more and more convinced you're right, and harder because it's, how do you explain to the President of the United States or the Congress, we've told you this for 10 years and we've decided we're wrong. So you have to do a pretty good job of explaining, here's why we think we're wrong, but we have to realize that the number of times you make a judgment doesn't make it that much stronger. It also sort of works in reverse. I mean, sometimes if we're surprised, as we were on the 73 war, we then tend to take that baggage with us. So after the 73 war, I think we focused a bit too much on the next time all of the Arab armies surrounding Israel would gather together and invade Israel. Well, that probably wasn't going to happen. But we weren't going to be surprised again. The lingo of the day between 73 and when I was an analyst was an Arab cold start, a Syrian cold start. And I think that much of that drew from sort of the pain of having been wrong in 73. I experienced that after 9/11 as well. And Charlie and I have talked at length about the steps we took after 9/11. Some of them were taken because we desperately wanted to prevent another 9/11. We desperately wanted to prevent another mistake. In that case, most of those steps, I think, resulted in the safety of the nation. But you need to let go of your failure and think about the future. So the sixth thing is an issue I think we struggle with. We can't let the focus on tactical day-to-day details prevent us from noticing change. And strategic change is really hard to notice when you're in the midst of it. It's hard to detect. It's nearly impossible to do unless you're consciously looking for it. And ironically, I think the people who are the most ill-equipped to see change are the experts who follow the issues most closely. So the people who you rely on to analyze an issue are exactly the wrong people to tell you when that issue is sort of veering off in a different direction. And the last thing, I think, is something that really was too frequent in our Iraq analysis, and that is we didn't distinguish what we knew from what we didn't know from what we thought. And in fact, sometimes if we think something for long enough, then we think we know it. And there is a big difference between what we think, our conclusions, our analysis, and fact. Let me just wrap up and come back to the subject of my part of the seminar, which is the relationship between intelligence and policymakers. It is critical. It's why we exist. We need to be responsive and relevant and reliable and expert. And looking back over my career, some of my best memories are of engaging with the policy side of the house, trying to figure out a complicated issue when the stakes were high and the situation blurry. Often the satisfaction came from helping policymakers think through really tough problems, like the peace process. Sometimes it came from sharing in important successes, like unraveling a terrorist plot or finding a key terrorist. Often it came from knowing that our analysis, that my analysis, was giving our customer what D&I McConnell once really aptly described as decision advantage. And I really can't step away from the issue without mentioning the constant challenge that we intelligence professionals face in trying to find the right balance between being too close to our policy customer so that we risk becoming attached to the policies and risking our objectivity, and yet on the other hand, keeping too distant and losing touch with what really matters, with what the policymaker really cares about, and yet retaining our perfect objectivity. I think we can easily balance between those two. We don't need to choose, but we always need to be aware of the tension between the two. And I can still remember when I was a junior analyst, the hardest part of writing a paper, the last section, and we always saved it for last. We struggled with coming up with something that was relevant and interesting. And the section was always called Implications for the United States. And you would think, after spending weeks, and in my day, months or sometimes years, writing a paper, that at the end of that process, you would have a really good idea of why this was important, why this was of value to our policy customers. But often, we struggled, and we really didn't know. And in 25 or 30 years ago, I think our interaction with the policy community was more distant. Today, it's easier to make that judgment. But we still sometimes, I think, analysts still struggle with what's really important to the United States. And that's something that I think we need to build into our analysis and figure out before we write a paper, why is this important? And we owe it to the nation to do our best to explain problems as clearly and objectively as we can, and always to learn lessons from the past. As I said, some of my most frustrating days were spent trying to get my message across, and sometimes I never did. But my fondest memories come from the knowledge that analysis figured into really important decisions. Iraq, the peace process, Middle East diplomacy, protecting the country from terrorism. It's the impact on policy that makes for a memorable and a satisfying career. So thank you again to the CIA for making the documents available. Thank you to the Nixon Library for hosting this incredibly important event. And I think you have a treat in store for you. I'm looking forward to listening to the amazing spectrum of expertise that the panelists and the next speaker will share. Thank you.